Imagine a movie that nearly didn't exist in any recognizable form, starring actors who repeatedly said no before finally saying yes, built around a wardrobe that had to be assembled from street corners and last-minute panic buys, and driven by a story that began as something so dark and unromantic that the finished film shares almost nothing with its original blueprint. Pretty Woman is one of those rare productions where everything that could go wrong did go wrong. And somehow, against every reasonable expectation, what came out the other side was magic. £360 million at the worldwide box office, the third highest-grossing film of 1990. A romantic comedy so deeply embedded in popular culture that decades later, people still quote it, still rewatch it, and still reach for a tissue at the fire escape scene. And none of it, not a single frame, was guaranteed. What most people carrying a soft spot for this film have no idea about is where it actually came from. The original screenplay, written by J.F. Lawton, carried the title $3,000, and that title alone tells you everything about how different the original vision was. No whimsy, no fairy tale warmth, no Roy Orbison soundtrack floating over a Hollywood love story. Lawton wrote a dark, unsentimental drama about a young woman working as a prostitute in Hollywood who enters into a relationship with a wealthy businessman, and the script tackled substance addiction bluntly, without softening the edges or reaching for a happy ending. The couple's dynamic in those early pages was complicated in ways designed to unsettle rather than charm, and the conclusion offered none of the romantic resolution that audiences eventually fell in love with. That version of the story never made it to theaters, and the credit for that belongs almost entirely to Disney. When the studio acquired the rights to Lawton's script, they brought in director Gere Marshall, a filmmaker who had spent his career perfecting the art of making audiences laugh and cry in the same 90 minutes. Marshall recognized the potential buried inside the material, but understood that unlocking it would require a fundamental rethinking of tone, structure, and purpose. Several rewrites followed, each one pulling the story further from its grim origins and closer to something lighter, warmer, and more emotionally generous. Jeffrey Katzenberg, serving as Disney's president at the time, pushed hard for a fairy tale quality, something that would feel less like social realism and more like a modern Cinderella story with sharper dialogue and better shoes. That push shaped everything that came after, and from it emerged The Escort with a heart of gold, The Corporate Raider with a carefully hidden capacity for genuine feeling, and a week-long arrangement that slowly, unexpectedly, became something neither of them had bargained for. Even the title change required deliberation. $3,000 lingered as a working title for longer than you might expect, but as the tone shifted further from dark drama toward romantic fairy tale, the number started feeling increasingly wrong. One producer reportedly pointed out that it sounded less like a love story and more like a bank advertisement, or possibly a science fiction film set in some ambiguous future. Pretty Woman replaced it, borrowed from the Roy Orbison classic that captured both the character of Vivian Ward and the spirit the film was now reaching for. And that single change reframed the entire project. What had begun as a transactional title became something that felt cinematic and warm, and none of that happened without argument. Finding the right actors to carry this reworked story turned into one of the longest and most complicated casting processes the production encountered. For the role of Edward Lewis, Gere Marshall assembled a wish list that reads like a catalog of 1980s Hollywood power. Christopher Reeve, Daniel Day-Lewis, Kevin Kline, Denzel Washington, Albert Brooks, Burt Reynolds, John Travolta, Liam Neeson, Sting, Sam Neill, Charles Grodin, Christopher Lambert, and Michael Douglas all appeared on it at various points. Al Pacino screen-tested with Julia Roberts and then walked away, deciding that the role simply didn't suit him, and looking back, that instinct seems correct even if it caused headaches at the time. Richard Gere proved even harder to lock down. Early drafts of the script portrayed Edward as cold and manipulative in ways that Gere found difficult to connect with, and he declined the role initially, leaving the production in a difficult position. Producer Gary W. Goldstein refused to accept that answer. Convinced that Gere was the only person who could make Edward both believable and ultimately lovable, he kept the door open and eventually enlisted Julia herself to make the case. Armed with nothing more than a post-it note and the kind of directness that would later become synonymous with her screen presence, she showed up at Gere's apartment and handed him the note with 3 words written on it. "Please say yes." Gere later described being completely disarmed by the sincerity of the gesture, by the absence of calculation or performance in how she delivered it. He said yes, the deal was done, and what followed was a chemistry so natural and so genuinely warm that it's now impossible to picture anyone else in either role. Julia's own casting had been far from certain. Disney's instinct when they acquired the script was to fill the lead with a more established name, someone whose presence would guarantee audience attention before a single frame had been shot. Gary Marshall's first preference was Karen Allen, and Meg Ryan ranked high on the shortlist as well. Both declined, which opened the door to a full audition process that brought in Laura Dern, Demi Moore, Marisa Tomei, Annabella Sciorra, Lorraine Bracco, Michelle Pfeiffer, Valeria Golino, Patricia Arquette, and Mary Steenburgen, among others. Molly Ringwald turned the role down, uncomfortable with the idea of playing a call girl. Winona Ryder and Jennifer Connelly were considered and then passed over as too young. Diane Lane came agonizingly close, only for a scheduling conflict to pull the role out of her reach at the last moment. As the production timeline tightened and the studio faced the genuine possibility of losing Julia to another project, the decision was made to back the woman who had been there from the beginning. Once filming started, the gap between what audiences would eventually see and what was actually happening on set became a recurring theme. Some of the film's most iconic moments came from accidents and improvisation rather than careful planning. The scene where Edward snaps the jewelry case shut just as Vivian reaches for the necklace, making her flinch and then laugh, was never in the script. Richard Gere invented the snap in the moment. Julia Roberts' reaction was entirely unplanned, and Gary Marshall kept the cameras rolling long enough to capture something that no amount of scripting could have produced on purpose. That necklace, by the way, was not a prop from the costume department. It was a genuine piece of jewelry valued at $250,000, and the store that loaned it dispatched an armed security guard to stand watch over it for the entire duration of filming. The armed guard, standing just off camera, while 2 actors created one of cinema's most charming improvised moments, is a detail that says a great deal about how this production operated. The opera scene carried its own complications, starting with the choice of La Traviata, which was no accident. The opera tells the story of a glamorous courtesan swept up by the promise of a different kind of life, and the parallel with Vivian's journey was so precise that it functioned as a mirror embedded inside the film itself. Original plans called for filming the exterior sequences in San Francisco, a choice that would have added grandeur and authenticity to the sequence, but a 6.9 magnitude earthquake forced a complete change of plans. The production relocated the exterior shots to the History Museum at the University of Southern California instead, and the transition was handled so smoothly that most viewers have never noticed anything was changed. Meanwhile, the necklace Julia wore for that scene was a custom creation by the French jeweler Fred Joaillier, built from 23 pear-cut rubies set in 18-karat white gold with diamond-encrusted hearts, valued at around £200,000. Security on set during those scenes was, understandably, thorough. The red dress that Vivian wears to the opera ranks among the most recognized costume pieces in Hollywood history, and it almost didn't exist in that form. The studio wanted black, a safer and more conventional choice that costume designer Marilyn Vance found completely wrong for the moment. Vance understood that the scene required something that would announce itself visually, something bold enough to carry the emotional weight of Vivian's transformation, and confident enough to make audiences understand immediately that everything had changed for this character. She pushed back, created 3 separate dress designs for the scene, and when the red off-the-shoulder gown was presented alongside the alternatives, the decision made itself. That dress became more than a costume. It became a symbol of everything the film was building toward. A visual shorthand for the shift from vulnerability to confidence that defined Vivian's arc, and Vance's willingness to argue for it against studio preference turned out to be one of the most consequential decisions anyone made during production. Other wardrobe moments were rather less carefully considered. The red vintage jacket that Vivian wears at the film's opening, draped over her mini dress and thigh-high boots, is the first major impression the character makes on screen, and it came together in a panic. The costume department realized they didn't have the jacket the script called for, spotted a cinema usher on the street, bought the jacket off the usher's back for $30, and put it on Julia Roberts. That jacket appeared in front of millions of viewers worldwide. $30, purchased from a stranger, became part of cinema history. Continuity errors crept into the finished film as well, and some of them became famous. A scene in which Vivian undoes Edward's tie proceeds normally enough until the camera cuts away and then returns to find the tie fully done up again, then cuts back to find it undone once more, as though the knot had a mind of its own. Far more widely discussed is the breakfast scene, where a croissant in Vivian's hand transforms into a pancake between cuts, a pancake that already has a bite taken out of it before she's had any apparent opportunity to take one. Some viewers constructed explanations, but the pre-existing bite mark makes it clear that no logical explanation holds. The continuity supervisor had a bad day, and that bad day has been discussed and replayed by film fans ever since. Behind individual scenes were physical mishaps that the polished, finished product gives no indication of. Julia Roberts became so nervous before filming the intimate scene with Richard Gere that a vein visibly protruded from her forehead, and the anxiety also triggered a case of hives severe enough that the makeup department kept calamine lotion on set throughout filming. Gary Marshall stopped production, climbed into bed alongside his 2 lead actors, and massaged the vein on Julia's forehead until it subsided, and filming could resume. That's a level of directorial involvement that falls somewhat outside standard practice. The fight scene between Gere and Jason Alexander, who played Edward's lawyer, Philip Stuckey, was staged with instructions to make it feel as real as possible, and both actors threw themselves into it with enough genuine commitment that a particularly well-landed blow knocked a crown loose in Gere's mouth. Nobody planned for that, but nobody stopped the scene either. The bubble bath scene produced its own memorable moment when the entire crew silently evacuated the set while Julia was submerged under the bubbles, leaving her to surface alone, apart from the single cameraman who was still rolling. The scene where Vivian lies on the floor laughing while watching I Love Lucy required Gary Marshall to find a way to generate authentic, uncontrolled laughter from Roberts, and various accounts describe him tickling her feet off camera to catch her off guard. Julia later suggested in an interview that this had become something of a myth, and that Marshall had simply told jokes to get her laughing. But whatever method he used, the result was a moment of screen joy that reads as completely genuine. Edward's car became a point of unexpected difficulty as well. The production approached Ferrari and Porsche about featuring their vehicles in the film, and both brands declined, citing concerns about being associated with the film's subject matter involving paid companionship. Lotus stepped in with their 1989.5 Esprit SE, and the silver car became so thoroughly identified with Edward's character that its appearance in the film drove orders for the model to triple in the months following the film's release. Ferrari and Porsche, watching a rival brand harvest that attention while they'd stayed on the sidelines, had presumably mixed feelings about their decision. The fire escape ending that audiences embraced required 9 takes to capture, and the path to filming it at all involved a significant rewrite. The original script resolved the story with Vivian being ejected from Edward's car following an argument, a conclusion that would have left audiences with something far colder and more ambiguous than what they got. The decision to replace it with Edward climbing toward Vivian, roses in hand, the sound of opera drifting in from somewhere nearby, changed the emotional register of the entire film. Getting that shot, though, I meant managing Richard Gere's suit getting dirtied from repeated stair climbs, Julia Roberts' shoes slipping on the metal steps, opera music floating in from a neighboring building, and pigeons choosing the most inconvenient possible moments to fly through the frame. 9 takes. Every single one found something new to go wrong. Filming took place across real Los Angeles locations that grounded the film's fantasy in recognizable geography. The Beverly Wilshire Hotel provided its lobby and exterior for multiple scenes, while the historic Ambassador Hotel, long since demolished, contributed additional footage. The restaurant, where Vivian nervously confronts her first plate of escargot, was a real establishment called Cicada. The Rodeo Drive boutique, where she faces dismissive treatment from shop assistants, stood at 9501 Santa Monica Boulevard, originally operating as Boule Miche Boutique, now home to the Badgley Mishka store. In celebration of the film's 25th anniversary, the Beverly Wilshire offered a Pretty Woman for a Day package priced at £66,000, which included a stay in the presidential suite and 3 hours of personalized shopping on Rodeo Drive, essentially selling audiences the experience of living inside the film for a weekend. Made on a budget of $14 million, Pretty Woman earned £360 million worldwide, landed as the third highest-grossing film of 1990, and became the 4th most successful romantic comedy in cinema history. Julia Roberts became an international star almost overnight. Richard Gere's career found new momentum, and a script that began as a dark drama called $3,000 nearly cast a dozen different actors, almost put its lead in a black dress, bought its most recognizable jacket from a stranger for $30, and had to relocate its opera sequence after an earthquake, became the film that defined what a romantic comedy could be. Every near miss, every last-minute fix, every improvised moment and unexpected accident added something to the finished product. And what audiences got was a film that still feels alive decades later, still earns new viewers, and still delivers on the promise of a genuinely great love story told with warmth, wit, and an awful lot of behind-the-scenes chaos.